Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks for everyone joining us online and at our hubs. I'd like to introduce Helen Findlay from the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, who is a biological oceanographer and is going to talk to us about the impacts of sea ice loss on marine ecology and biodiversity. So take it away, Helen.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me to speak to you today. So I have been studying processes around sea ice for a few years. My main focus of research is actually ocean acidification and climate change in more open ocean systems. But for the last couple of years, we've been working with collaborators to look at how these kind of processes are changing in the sea ice. But I'm going to give a fairly generic talk today to just highlight some of the sea ice processes that are happening in the Arctic Ocean and why they're important, and look at how those relate to sea ice ecosystems and ecosystem services. So why are we concerned? Well, as most of you have heard probably a lot today, is that the sea ice is being lost from the Arctic Ocean. So we've seen a decrease in the extent of the sea ice cover, both in the summertime, but also throughout the whole year over the last 30 or so years. But we're also seeing a decrease in the thickness of the ice. So we're losing multi-year ice and seeing more first-year ice. And this means that the ice that is present in the ecosystem in the Arctic is not around for as long. It's freezing and refreezing and melting every year, as opposed to building up year on year and becoming thick multi-year ice. And you can see just in these examples here from March 1985, where you've got the thick white color is sea ice that's 4 years old or older. Whereas in March 2018, you can see there's very little of that ice remaining. So what are we actually talking about when we're talking about sea ice and the sea ice thickness? This is an image from a trip that I was part of in 2010, so a good 10 years ago. And this is this was the high Canadian Arctic, so above the Canadian archipelago. And we had a team of scientists go and live on the sea ice. And this is a couple of explorers that came with us, and they went further off and did some measurements for us using their sleds and skis. And this was what they were coming across, this thick multi-year ice. This is ice that is perhaps, with Charlie here is about, he's a bit taller than me. So he's, you can imagine that block of ice there is maybe about 3 or 4 meters high, and he's standing on about a meter's thickness of ice there. So we're talking about ice that's been pushed up together. It's rubble ice. It's very tall structures, and this is the sort of ice that you would expect to have seen across a lot of the Arctic Ocean many years ago, and we really are seeing less and less of this every year now. And this is what we're talking about when we're talking about thin first-year ice that is freezing and refreezing and melting every year. So you can see in this picture, you've got the open leads, the open water, compared to some of the other, the last photo, you've got very thin ice. You can see the ice forming. You've got the frost flowers at the front here, and then maybe just 20 centimeters or so of thickness of sea ice. So why does that matter for ecosystems and communities? Well, this is the classic food chain that we think of when we're talking about Arctic and the Arctic sea ice. Sea ice actually houses marine organisms itself. So within the sea ice, you can get ice algae and other organisms that feed on that ice algae. And that ice algae is the base of the food chain for many of those organisms. Those organisms way up to really feed to the rest of the food chain, right up to the kind of creatures that we think of polar bears and seals and walruses. So when you look at this blank white canvas, actually what's going on is all of this underneath and around it. But it's not just the food web that's there and is important for the sea ice processes. So I'm going to talk a little bit to this recent policy brief that just came out from the BEPC program last week. If you want any more information, please contact Nadia Steiner. She's the co-chair for this project. It's the Biogeochemical Exchange Processes at Sea and Ice Interfaces. I'm actually not part of that project, but I know Nadia well and the community that was involved in it. And I thought the policy brief was a very nice way of explaining some of the sea ice processes. So I just wanted to highlight it and use some of their examples. In that report, they suggest that actually sea ice is an ecologically or biologically significant area. And this is particularly important when we think about looking after and monitoring and managing the sea ice, because if we can get it criteriaed under this, then we can see that it's actually worth conserving. I mean, we know it is, but this is a way of actually being able to say, look, this is an important ecosystem that we need to manage and to look after. It's unique. It's got special importance for all life's history stages. It's being threatened. It's vulnerable. It's not going to be there for much longer if we don't do anything about it. So it's biologically diverse, and it's high in naturalness. The biological productivity is the only one of those tick boxes that is medium, and that is probably going to increase because of the open oceans that we're starting to see. So this is one of the figures in the policy brief that I quite like, and I'll go through some of these in a bit more detail. But what we can see and what we'll discuss is the sea ice processes and how they change through the seasonal cycle and relate to ecosystem services. So if we go back to this figure of sea ice, when we look at this, we see the white canvas, and I've already explained about the food web processes, but actually there's much more going on in terms of biogeochemistry and the biodiversity as well. So we think about the sea ice itself. We've got a microbial community that live within the sea ice. Those microbes are remineralizing products all the time. They're consuming that algae, they're taking the nutrients, and they're regenerating it and remineralizing it within the sea ice itself. But as sea ice forms, actually what it's doing is that salt water in the seawater, as it freezes, is coming out of the sea ice and draining down into the deeper waters. And what it does is it takes that nutrient with it. So the sea ice is actually a source for nutrients at that time of year when the sea ice is freezing. And it's causing a mixing and nutrient supply to the ocean below the sea ice. And that's an important process for actually being able to then, once the light comes back to the Arctic and the sea ice does start to retreat, then we start to see the phytoplankton in the ocean, the small microscopic plants that live in the ocean, they start to bloom. So without this nutrient supply, this regeneration, we would be losing that phytoplankton nutrient mixing. It's also imperative this mixing is part of the ocean circulations. The sea ice contributes significantly to the start of the ocean circulations for the whole global planet. So without sea ice forming in the Arctic and the Antarctic, we would struggle to have the circulation as we know it today across the whole globe. We can also talk about ice-snow atmospheric interactions. And what we would expect to see is that warmer ice is going to change the dynamics of the microbial communities that are living in it. These microbial communities and the interactions they play are also fundamental for releasing biogenic gases, such as bromide, chloride, and iodine. And these have consequences when they go into the atmosphere, they get oxidized and add to the atmospheric oxidizing gases. And that has consequences for feedbacks to climate. We've talked about ecosystem interactions. So we've got everything from carbon export directly from the ice algae in the sea ice itself, going down into the seabed. In the Arctic, the food chain is relatively short. So you have ice algae, which seasonally gets dumped down into the seafloor very rapidly. And that really stimulates the bottom creatures, the seabed creatures that are living down at the bottom waters. If we lose the ice cover, then we change those dynamics. So we're having to have species that rely perhaps more on the phytoplankton, the open water phytoplankton, as opposed to relying on that dynamic of sea ice algae. When we switch to an open water system or a loss of the sea ice, of the multi-year ice, we are getting more light penetrating through into the Arctic Ocean as well. And that has consequences for driving these phytoplankton, the space of the food web. So if you increase the light, we expect to see an increase in that primary production. And finally, we can talk also about climate and gas uptake and production. So again, what we expect is that the ice, when it covers the ocean, we expect a relatively minimal exchange between the atmosphere and the ocean in terms of CO2 gas, for example. Although there's still a lot of uncertainties around that. But we expect that when the ice retreats and we have more open ocean, then you would expect to see more of that flux of gases between the ocean and the atmosphere. Which way that flux will go in the future is still very much uncertain. The other aspects related to ice and ice algae and phytoplankton is that those phytoplankton communities can release things like dimethyl sulfide, which you may have come across, or volatile organic compounds. And those gases are fundamental for helping to produce cloud condensation nuclei, and that results in clouds being formed in the atmosphere. So if we're moving to a more open ocean system or less sea ice present, then those products are going to be more released into the atmosphere, and we're going to have a feedback there on the chemistry and the climate system. Again, there's also processes that could potentially release methane. As you warm the snow and the ice, you get a release of the methane into the atmosphere, so there's another feedback there. So altogether, what we're seeing is that the sea ice is not just a blank canvas, it's not just white. It's got a huge amount of important sea ice processes that are related to that and the ecosystem around it. So how does that really relate to people, and why should we care? Well, we can think about it in terms of ecosystem services. And these are the main four that the BEPSI project have come up with that relate to these sea ice processes. So we can think of it in terms of supporting services in the form of habitats, feeding grounds, nursery grounds, and providing habitat for all kind of life cycle stages of all marine organisms. We can think of provisioning services, so things that provide food or supply of materials, but also things like the untapped biopotential of some of these organisms that we may lose that are endemic to the sea ice. We don't know yet whether maybe they have the answer to some of our problems in terms of medicinal help and genetic resources. There's cultural services, so we can think about tourism or cultural activities, research, but also the indigenous communities that live in these societies are at fundamental risk of losing their local knowledge systems, their cultural identity and spirituality. And finally, regulating services, as I hope has become clear, that this sea ice is fundamental for controlling planetary radiative balance, production of biogenic aerosols, atmospheric cleansing, and the release and uptake of climatically relevant gases. So I'm going to leave and finish on this slide really just to say that we can mitigate these disruptive changes. We are on a path where we're going to likely see very little sea ice over the summertime. By the end of the century, these things are locked in now to some extent. But we can change the future in terms of being able to still have winter cover and how much sea ice cover we can experience. But we can also do other things to help with this. To mitigate some of the worst disruptive changes, we need to reduce emissions, but we can manage some of these co-stressors. And if we can protect and increase the habitat, especially by putting in place some of these management MPAs and saying that this is an ecologically relevant and special area, then that will help to be able to protect the habitat. And of course, as a scientist, I would say we need to invest in science, but also in partnerships and education. And it's really nice to see some of the new projects that are coming up where we're actually starting to really build on international partnerships. We've got a new UK project that's looking at bringing UK and Canada, but Inuit communities are very much at the center of that. And that's really nice to see that sort of development. So I will end there. Thank you very much for listening.
That was a really interesting talk, and I think that picture of the multi-year ice block will stay with me for a long time. I'd like to welcome back Walt Meyer to the stage. Walt's a sea ice scientist at the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and he's going to carry on the theme of sea ice biology coupling.
Okay, thank you. I'll talk. I think hopefully we'll complement Helen. So she did a great overview and really got into a lot of details that I'll hopefully complement. So I'm at the National Snow and Ice Data Center. I just want to give a quick introduction for those that aren't familiar and those that haven't heard this earlier today. Apologies for those that have. our main area at the National Snow and Ice Data Center is managing and distributing data, particularly from NASA, but we also have a NOAA component. It's a lot of satellite data, a lot of physical data, and supporting that data. But we also have a pretty active research group of several scientists, including myself, and we have a group that works with local and traditional knowledge as well. And one area that we don't really have a lot of expertise in is in like the biogeochemistry area. So I'm working based on work from others and folks I've collaborated with a little bit on various reports. So sea ice loss in the Arctic, as is well known. We've lost the summer sea ice. It's melting out earlier, and then it's freezing up later. This is October, showing the really large trends we see with open water lasting into the autumn, well into the autumn, and even in towards the winter. More open water is going to be more phytoplankton blooms earlier, potentially, and more frequent, and more under ice blooms. Fish habitats moving north as there's more open water, as well as other open water species, and then megafauna losing habitat, which is well known. A couple other things, that there's the coastal snow and potential rain on snow events. I just wanted to mention that. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but this has kind of feedbacks with the terrestrial region as well. There's been well documented issues with rain on snow causing, and it refreezes, and the crust and reindeer not being able to access the grasses underneath the snow, which in part may be tied to losses of sea ice. And then ocean acidification was mentioned as well. And I'm not going to go into that. That's well outside of my area, but I think that's an important thing to consider, because as these changes are happening, it's not only physical changes, it's also the biogeochemistry and even open water species that may have some enhanced habitat still will have to deal with that as well. So the Arctic amplification, just a little background, the Arctic is warming about 2 to 3 degrees faster than the rest of the globe. And so you can see this is some nice graphics from Zach Labe at Colorado State, who puts together some really nice images. This is another one showing the warming. This is on the y-axis is the January down to the December, showing that the warming, of course, and then the year along the x-axis, 1950 to 2020. So you see this obviously greatly increased warming as we get into more recent years. The redder is the warmer years, blue is the colder years, but also it's focused more in the autumn and through the winter and spring. The summer doesn't have a lot of difference, a lot of change compared to the earlier years, because the ice cover, a lot of the energy that's going into the ice cover is going towards melting the ice, and so the summer is not seeing as much warming. Stronger storms with more ocean, that's going to stir up nutrients, stir up stronger waves. That has potential implications. Also also along the coastline, and we've seen in terms of human impacts, effects on the coastal erosion, but that also affects their hunting and fishing and so forth. And so somewhat not totally direct, but I just wanted to repeat this from my earlier talk because I think this is interesting. And we've seen changes in coastal erosion and increases around the Arctic. Another thing that I think is an interesting thing to contemplate is the shipping lanes. This again is thought of as a human impact. It certainly is, less ice, more shipping, but also means more potential pollution, black carbon, potential for oil spills and things like that would have big impacts on the ecosystem. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, even though it might be a second order indirect impact. I'll skip that one. So in terms of direct ecosystem impacts, one of the ones that gets a lot of attention is the charismatic megafauna. I really like this photo. It's a little blurry. I haven't been able to get super high resolution one, but these are walrus sitting on an ice floe. A lot of people, the polar bears get most of the press, maybe the seals a little less, but the walrus are another species that are really dramatically affected and are already being affected by the retreat of the ice. The walrus typically would kind of hang out along the ice edge. The ice retreats during the summer. It wouldn't retreat too far from the coastline. It'd be kind of over the shallow shelf region. The walrus feed on the bottom, the shallow shelf. They can easily access that. But the ice edge is retreated far north, well past the shelf area, for example, in like the Beaufort Sea. So now the ice edge is over the deep Arctic Ocean. There's no food for the walrus there, so they can't follow the ice like they used to. So a lot of them are going on to small islands, and that's they're overcrowded, or on ice floes like this ice floes. There's overcrowded. They're stressed. They get into fights. So it's a real detriment to the walrus as the ice edge has retreated. This is kind of a similar figure, although not as complete and as detailed as Helen's here. But one thing that shows the kind of the seasonal evolution. It goes from the dark winter period where there's not much going on into the early spring. The ice is still there. You get the under ice blooms that starts to get into the activity going into springtime. And then as the ice goes away, you get the summer blooms, late spring, early summer blooms with the open water. And you get this strong coupling, particularly with the bottom feeding organisms. In terms of plankton, one of the things with the ice loss is you have more open water, thinner ice cover. So even under ice blooms, as was talked about, can increase. And there is evidence of that. This is from the AMIP snow water ice permafrost in the Arctic, or SWIPA report back in 2017 I was a part of. And they showed throughout the Arctic increases in what we call double blooms, where you get a second bloom during the season, and particularly even up to 70% higher in some areas, and compared to the late 90s, early 2000s. So we're seeing increases in plankton activity, algae activity. Chlorophyll A indicating plankton. This is from the NOAA Arctic report card last year. They had a primary productivity essay, which is a nice little essay, and looked at, this is in 2020, and showed some pretty large, particularly in like the Laptev Sea area, some pretty large blooms in high concentrations compared to average. And so these things, this is just 1 year, but we're seeing a general increase. This is from the same report, showing the time series from 2003 through 2019. And there are some areas that are not showing a significant trend, but most areas are showing a fairly sizable increase in terms of primary productivity. However, you do see in terms of flora and fauna that rely on the ice and need the ice. Of course, their habitat is starting to disappear. And if so, this was also from the SWIPA report. The flora, the various species doesn't show quite as much of a change, but in terms of the fauna, the copepods and so forth, have showed definitely a decreasing change compared to earlier decades. Another one, just kind of to finish up, to do something a little different than the polar bears. This was in the 2019 Arctic report card. The ivory gull population, and ivory gulls they live right near the sea ice. You can see the dots there are their various habitats right within the sea ice covered areas or nearby. They're a top predator and scavenger associated with sea ice. And there's been, not all the populations have declined, but certain populations like the Canadian population and like the Canadian archipelago, the high Canadian Arctic, have seen significant reductions. That's about 70% since the 1980s, they found. And that may be related to sea ice change. This is also from the NOAA, like I said, the NOAA Arctic report card. But there's other factors that may play a role. As top predators and scavengers, the pollution and contaminants will goes up the food chain, and so that might be playing a role as well, as they are getting higher concentrations of that. So, kind of my main conclusions: less ice, less habitat for ice-adapted species like like polar bears, walrus, seals, and some fish and birds that rely on that sea ice. And then, but less ice means an expanded range, expanded habitat for species that want the open water. Whales and some fishes, we've seen, evidence of increased populations. Fisheries will move north. That presents some problems. I'm not at all a fishery expert, or especially in terms of regulations, but from folks I've talked to, the fisheries, as the fisheries move north, like into the Arctic Ocean, there aren't regulations there. The regulations are for the habitat or where they have lived. And so what happens if they move into new habitats? New regulations will probably be needed in terms of how to manage the fisheries. There will be winners and losers. Some species will have new habitats, but others are going to lose habitat as well. But I think ocean acidification, which has been talked about elsewhere, is going to be key too, because it's the oceans acidify. It's going to affect a lot of species, whether there's ice there or not. And I think just kind of everyone probably knows this, but without the perennial sea ice, as we get to ice-free summers, the Arctic sea, ecosystems going to be fundamentally changed. So I'll just finish there. Thanks to Pam Pearson and the International Cryosphere and Climate Initiative for inviting me to be here and present, and for the support. So thank you.
Thanks, Walt. Could I invite Helen back up to the mic, and maybe we'll take some questions from the audience. There's a second mic here, so you can both have a place. Do we have any questions from those who are in the room? Or do we have any questions from online? So I have a question for you, Helen. It seems like we're just going to get loads of light and loads of phytoplankton blooming, and the Arctic is just going to kind of explode with life in the summer. But I mean, can it feasibly, at least fish life, can it feasibly do that, given that it's so dark and inhospitable in the winter? Is that actually going to happen, or do animals like fish need hospitable conditions all year round?
Yeah, I think we're all still going to be limited by, you're always going to have the dark winters. So even if we got to a situation where there was no or very little ice, you would still have that seasonal discrepancy between the summer and the winter. And so you are going to have to still have light adaptive species, so species that are specifically able to cope with that, those conditions, and make rapid use of the light as it comes up. So there's two factors really that affect phytoplankton growth, or growth of plants. The light is one aspect, but the other aspect is also the nutrient regime and how much nutrients they have. And there's still a lot of uncertainty and discrepancies across the different parts of the Arctic Ocean as to how much nutrients will become available, and that will drive the phytoplankton and the productivity of the oceans. So we think for the Atlantic side of the ocean, where you've got the Atlantic influence, and you've got very much an opening up of the sea ice, especially in the Barents Sea and around kind of the north of Svalbard area, then you are what we're seeing is Atlantification, essentially. So you're bringing up those warmer, saltier waters, which have much higher nutrients, and it has a bigger mixing regime. But in the Pacific side, there's much lower nutrients already in that region, and it's also much shallower. Through the Bering Strait is maybe only about 50 meters or so, 100 meters deep. And so there's different regimes in terms of the circulation patterns and the nutrients patterns. And so I think what we'll find is that depending on where we are in the Arctic, you'll still get discrepancies in the amount of productivity that's available. So I hope that helps.
One question from the audience,
which is, related to what he asked. So basically, if there is a higher, maybe I missed it in your presentation, but maybe, so if there is a higher productivity, it means a higher potential a stronger potential carbon sink there. And under a global warming scenario, we can have maybe more CO2 that is captured there, or it's too small, the region? Or...
No, it's very complicated. You're right. If we have more productivity, then we expect that the phytoplankton are going to be absorbing that carbon dioxide. the Arctic itself is a very complex region in terms of the chemistry that goes on there. So we study a lot of the ocean acidification aspects and the carbon storage. And so what we see at the moment in the open ocean is that CO2 is being taken up into the oceans in the Arctic. And especially as it moves from the Atlantic region and the Pacific region, it gathers up that CO2 as it cools down. So colder water can absorb more CO2 naturally. But what we don't understand yet is really how warming is going to affect that, because if you warm up the oceans, you're potentially getting an outgassing of CO2. But also, as you go into the Arctic, you add freshening of it. So you've got the ice loss, that's adding fresh water. You've also got immense amounts of river runoff into the Arctic Ocean. And so the fresh water coming off those off land is diluting the ability of the ocean to take up that carbon dioxide, and because it's essentially adding low pH water or taking away the buffer capacity. And it's also adding organic matter. So we're seeing a lot more organic carbon going into the oceans from the rivers. And if you add organic carbon, then what we expect to see is actually more remineralization, more respiration. So you're adding more carbon dioxide to the system again. So it's a very complicated issue, and there's still lots of unknowns. But so I can't really say what it would be like, but it's very dynamic. Again, I think what we'll see is that different regions of the Arctic will behave quite differently, and we'll end up seeing quite different responses, kind of what I call the Atlantic influence zones, the river influence zones, and then the Pacific influence zones as well.
Do we have any more questions? Questions online, questions in the room? If not, I think we'll wrap that up. So thanks so much to Walt and to Helen for that really interesting talk, and we'll see you later for some Inuit throat singing.